Good evening, everyone. We're starting this live over again. We have Shauna here with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, and she's going to be presenting on canning tomatoes. Let's get started. Let me share the screen.
Good evening. Hello. Thank you for that introduction, Emily. My name, again, is Shauna Kutak. I am one of your county extension agents here in Brazoria County. I do lots of different things in my office, but one of the projects that's near and dear to my heart is food preservation and canning. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and jump right in. Okay, perfect. Okay, so everybody can see my screen now. So we're going to go ahead and jump right on in. So this is me. Here I am canning tomatoes. This is what I like to call our Rotel recipe. And so you can see the canner that I'm using is actually a pressure canner. My coworker likes to call tomatoes the divas of the garden. And I'm going to tell you that they're also the divas of the canning world too. It depends on your recipe, depends on how you're going to process your canned goods. So I'm going to skip to the next slide here. And so why do we can? Well, one of the reasons we can is to save money. And so I'm going to jump back to this. This is a pressure canner. It's an all-American canner. It was straight out of the box. It was about $400. So I like to joke that these Rotel jars cost me about $50 a jar to make. But of course, the more that you use it, the more economical it makes. But today we're going to be talking about water bath canning is what we're going to be talking about today. And one of the great things about water bath canning is that it doesn't really take any special equipment. And so there you really are being able to preserve your food and save some money at the same time. Another reason why it's so important to can our foods is for emergency preparedness. If you or if you know the people that just suffered from the week-long power outages, everybody lost so much food. If we had canned even like half of what was in our freezer, we would have so much more food. So that's another reason. Another reason I like to can is because we know exactly what we're putting in the jars. And so here's a quote I found from the internet. If you think canning is scary, start reading the ingredients on your store-bought food. It will help you overcome your fears. And so, again, that's another reason why we like to. And then I think it's fun. Canning is always fun, especially when you can do it with your family members or your friends. Okay, so we're going to jump into our water bathing tomatoes. And so historically, tomatoes were always water bath. And this is not so any day in today's world. So today you have to follow a trusted recipe. And so what exactly is a trusted recipe? We're going to talk about where you can find those later, but a trusted recipe is one that has been tested and made sure that the inside of your canning jar reaches a specific temperature. For water bath canning, it has to be 212 degrees. For pressure canning, we have to get that temperature up to 240 degrees. And so we know that any tested, trusted recipe, all trusted recipes have been tested. And so that's what we're going to find are the tested recipes. And you can find those in the cookbooks that are made from your canning companies and any AgriLife publications. We'll go over those too. Okay, so here we can see tomatoes are not like grandma's. Tomatoes are actually, they are not a high acid food, contrary to popular belief. You can see the little graph on the other side of my screen here. We have our pH levels. So the lower pH means higher acidity. And so we have our high acidity lemons, pickles, oranges. We move on down and there you can see the tomatoes. Tomatoes actually typically run at about 4.5 pH level. And the cutoff between the water bath canning and pressure canning is 4.6. And so you can see right there that it really just teeter-totters on that line. As we move on down, you can see our low acidity foods. We have our carrots, our beans, potatoes, most meats, and then we jump over into chicken, peas, corn, and then our last one is hominy and shrimp. And so today's tomatoes are actually bred for sweetness and not acidity. And then when we add our peppers, our onions, our celery, what we like to add to make salsa, to make spaghetti sauce, then you can see that then we're going to be mixing those low acid foods with the tomatoes that then will jump that pH level into a pressure canning category. And so what do you do? Well, you're going to follow the trusted recipe, tested recipes. These tested recipes will a lot of times add the acid for you. And the acid will most likely be like a lemon juice, maybe a little bit of vinegar or citric acid. And so we'll see that as we move on to our tested recipes. So here's a chart here with all the foods that we have. And you can see here again, we have our pickles, our apples, our raspberries, strawberries. All these are going to go into the water bath category. Then when you jump over to the low acid foods, which have a higher pH of 4.6, we have our meat, our corn, our potatoes, spinach, okra, carrots. And so, and then we have our tomatoes. Our tomatoes are on both sides of the chart. Sometimes we're going to water bath and sometimes we're going to pressure can, depending on the recipe. So here you can see we're going to pick the correct canning method. And so we have our tomatoes, the ones that are in the water bath. Those will have a little bit of acid added to it to make sure that it's at the higher acidity level. Those that are just straight tomatoes out of your garden, those will need to be pressure canned. Then we have any tomatoes with our vegetable mixtures. Those all need to be pressure canned. So any tomatoes with our okra, that moves it into the pressure canning. Tomato juice, tomato sauce, tomato paste, those tend to be higher in acidity. So we can easily go ahead and water bath those. Our spaghetti sauce is a no, because we're adding our mushrooms, we're adding our onions, our garlic, and a lot of times we add meat to our spaghetti sauce, and all meat needs to be pressure canned. And then we have our chili sauce. That's going to be a higher acidity level. And so we can jump that over into the category of our water bath. So why is the acid level so important? Well, we want to make sure that we are killing off any bacteria that is in the food. And so botulism is one of the consequences of not canning your food properly. And so if you get botulism from food that is not canned properly, these are some symptoms of them. Blurred vision, slurred speech, muscle weakness, abdominal distension, problem urinating, nausea, vomiting. And this is not just food poisoning. This is actually very dangerous, and it's the most dangerous form of bacteria in our food. And so people don't really hear about it as much as we used to. but it does actually happen, and that'll be on our next slide. We'll talk about that. So botulism is found in two forms. One is the vegetative state. The vegetative state can live without oxygen, and it's killed in a water bath canning process when we can get it up to 212 degrees. And so when it is in the spore form, those can only be killed at 240 degrees. And our pressure canner is the only way that we can get that food up to 240 degrees. We want that temperature to reach the inside, very, very inside of our food. All around, everything in that jar needs to reach those temperatures. With your water bath, it's 212. If you're pressure canning, it's 240. So botulism loves the low acid. If you have the high acid foods, we don't really worry about botulism much because it will not thrive in a high acidity environment, whereas the botulism thrives in the low acid. And so actually, about 2 weeks ago, there was a big breakout in California of botulism. And that was because it was some improperly canned cactus pads. And so that is a food that needs to be pressure canned. They went ahead and water bathed it. In 2023, there was an outbreak at the Rugby World Cup in France. There was a restaurant that decided to water bath some marinated sardines. And so they fed that to people, and there were 15 cases and 1 death related to that. I like to joke and say, well, let's just not can any sardines and we won't have to worry about botulism. But there are people who do really like those canned fish. Then in 2015, there was an outbreak at a church function, and it was all from the potato salad. Now, most people would think that the mayonnaise would be the culprit of the potato salad, but in this case, it was not food poisoning. It was actually botulism. 29 became sick, and 1 person died from that, and it was from the improperly canned potatoes. And so we are able to can potatoes, but it must be pressure canned so that we can reach those higher temperatures to kill off that botulism at 240 degrees. So we actually have 3 different types of canning methods. You always hear about our 2, water bath canning and pressure canning, and that's what I talk about a lot, but I'm super excited that now we have steam canning. The steam canning and the water bath canning both reach 212 degrees. So both of these are ideal way to process your foods if they are a high acid food. The one caveat kind of steam canning is you can only steam can for 45 minutes. So if you have a recipe that calls for a longer processing time, that's going to jump you up into your water bath canning with the water bath canner, not the steam canner. Any of our low acid foods then go into the pressure canner, and that heats our food to 240 degrees. USDA does not recommend pressure cookers for canning. So that's an important note. Okay, so we're going to move on to the water bath canner. What's in your water bath canner? Some tips and tricks. So your water bath canner is a very large pot. If you don't have a water bath canner, no problem. You can use a crawfish cooker. You can use a big stock pot. So it's not necessary that you go out and purchase or order from Amazon a water bath canner. You can use something that you have in your house. But what's super important is you see on this diagram, there is a bottom rack. The bottom rack is what you're going to need because we cannot have our jars hit the bottom of the pot. And so I love this diagram. It shows it really well. We have our rack space there. You can buy silicone racks at the store to use. So if you were going to use a big crawfish pot, you can go ahead and use a rack that you got from the store for, I think they're like $5 or $6. And then what's important and the big difference between the water bath and the pressure canner is for water bath, you're always going to want to have at least 1 inch of water above the jar. And so you can see that there above our jar, we always cover our jars with 1 inch of water. The diameter of your pot should be no more than 4 inches wider of your burner. And the most often foods that are processed in our water bath canner, we talked about that a little earlier, but we have our tomatoes, our fruits, our jellies, our jams, and our pickles. Those are all things that we can in our water bath canner. So the equipment that you're going to need for water bathing, we have our jars and lids. We have a jar lifter. So a jar lifter, I say that's one thing that you need to invest in. They have some really nice jar lifters and they run about $13. And so I would suggest getting a jar lifter. So you're going to need jars, and we'll talk about jars in more detail later. You're going to need jars, lids, a jar lifter. Then we have our funnel here. That is optional. A lot of times when I can, I don't even use a funnel, but it's nice to have. The next thing that is a piece of equipment is our headspace checker and bubble release. You are going to need something to release those bubbles, but it does not necessarily have to be anything that you go out and buy. In our classes, we use wooden popsicle sticks. Those work great for a bubble release. The magnet wand here are great for lid lifters, ring lifters, but the newest information out is you don't have to heat the lids. So back in the day when grandma was doing this, they always put the lids and the rings and heated those up, and that was to get the adhesive softened up. They have changed their formula, and so now the lids do not need to be heated. So sometimes old habits die hard. If you're used to putting those in the water, that's fine. It's not necessary anymore. And so we have the magnet lid wand to help with that. Another necessity for canning is our vinegar. If you add a little bit of splash in your canner, that will keep your jar from getting cloudy. So just a splash is all you need of vinegar, and then it works its magic. Also, we're always going to wipe the rim of our jars to get any food residue off. If you have food residue on your jar, then you run the risk of not having a good seal. So important tip there. And so last but not least are our tested recipes that we have. USDA is a great resource to use, and then So Easy to Preserve is another cookbook that you can get in addition to your Ball or Mason cookbooks, and then any publications from your AgriLife or Extension office. So needed must-have for canning, my opinion, are great jars and lids, and your jar lifter and your tested recipe with some vinegar. Those are what's necessary for your water bath canning. So our canning jars here. So I like to tell people garage sale is a great place to go look for these jars. And so you see them here. They come in 4 different sizes for canning. We have our quart, our pint, our half pint, and our quarter pint. And the processing time for each size is going to be different. So we're going to really read and follow our recipe. So if you have something in our pint jar, it's going to take less time to heat that food to 212 degrees than if you had a quart of the same food. So a quart processing time is going to be longer than the pint. The pint is going to be longer than the half pint. You can always process a longer amount of time, but you can never process a shorter amount of time. It's super important that we get that food up to that temperature so that it's killing any of those bacteria that are in the food. Also, when our food is reaching to that temperature, we're getting all of the air out Once all the air is out, then that lid sucks back down and creates a vacuum seal. And so that's going to be important to keep our food fresh. So prepare your jars before use. So you always want to inspect your jars, making sure that you don't have any cracks or chips in your jar. You're going to wash in hot water and rinse. So there's two schools of thought on soap or no soap. If you don't get your soap all the way out of your jar, then you run the risk of having a soapy tasting salsa or a soapy tasting jam. And so it's up to you, but it's not necessary, because what we are going to do is we are going to heat those jars in the boiling water that we have in our pot. And so we will be able to really heat and kill any of the bacteria that's in there. The purpose for really washing these out or getting the dust particles out. Okay, so our lids here, you can see in our picture here, we have different types of lids. The most common is our two-piece lid. It's a self-sealing lid and it has a ring. You're going to follow the manufacturer's instructions, but most of the time you will not have to heat that lid anymore. The ball and cur lids you use within 5 years of purchase. And then the bands can always be reused if they're not rusted, but the lids are a one-time use only. Other systems, there are a reusable lid, and you'll just follow the manufacturer's instructions on those. Those are really more popular in Canada. In the United States, you're seeing reusing our ball and cur most of the time. Okay, so here is our little utensil for headspace. Although, like I said in the previous slide, we really don't have to have this. We do need something to debubble, but you can see in our picture these lines where if your recipe tells you a 1/4 inch, then you go up to the very top of your ring here on the jar, and then you can see where the 1/2 inch is in the 1 inch line. And so I really love this diagram that shows that you don't have to go out and buy special equipment if you need to. Now the headspace, it will be in every recipe that you have where your headspace should be. That's all based in science where it needs to go. If you have too little headspace, your food can boil over the rim of the jar and your jar will not seal. If you have too much headspace, then the processing time will not get all of the air out, and you can risk a poor seal. And so I just want to reiterate the importance of following a tested recipe and getting that processing time in. I hear people all the time tell me, well, my jar has sealed. Well, just because it's sealed does not mean that it's canned safely and able to be eaten. And so I hear mostly when people put their hot salsa in their jar, they put the lid on, they put the ring on, and then it will seal. Well, yes, it has sealed, but you still have all the bacteria in your jar and the air has not escaped from the jar. It's during that processing time that we're able to kill any of our bacteria that will cause us to be sick, and is getting all of the air out. And so jams and jellies are another one. I hear people say all the time, well, I don't have to water bath them. They sealed. Well, yes, they sealed, but it's not safe to eat until you actually process your foods in the water bath canner. Okay, so only use tested recipes. Where do we find these tested recipes? I mentioned it earlier: Extension Publications, Ball, Cur, Mason, and any USDA guidelines. So if you have a recipe from grandma, I ask, is that a tested, trusted recipe? And the answer to that is no. Our food has changed over the years. The science behind home canning has changed over the years. And so it is not recommended to use any recipe that has not been in the Extension Publications, the Ball, the Cur, the Mason, or the USDA guidelines. Never do we want to alter or make up our own recipes. It's just absolutely not safe. And so there we go for finding your tested recipes. So packing methods, we have two different types of packing methods. So we have a raw pack and a hot pack. The way I remember it is hot food goes into hot jars that goes into our hot water bath. Then if you do a cold pack, we're going to have cold food going into cold jars that goes into cold water. And so that's kind of how I remember. Hot stays with hot, stays with hot, cold, cold, cold. And so our raw pack is when we place our unheated food in the jar. We're going to pour our boiling water, our juice, our syrup over the food until the proper headspace is reached. Hot pack is a preferred method, and you'll see these in most of your recipes. But again, some of the recipes will call for a hot pack. I mean, a raw pack, sorry. So the hot pack is when our food is heated for a recommended amount of time, and then it is packed in the jars. And you're going to add your boiling liquid right into that headspace until your headspace is reached. Okay, so I mentioned earlier our recipes have a preferred packing method. We're going to follow that. If you do have a choice, the hot pack is much easier. The food is easier to pack in the jars. There's less floating of the food. The color and flavor is better. And you can see here the float, which we will talk about later when our tomatoes are floating. Okay, so filling and sealing jars are actually 5 easy steps. So the first thing we're going to do is fill our jars. The second one is releasing our air bubbles. So we're going to take, I like to use a wooden popsicle stick. You can take the headspace tool and use that, but you're going to make sure that you get between the food and the jar down the side and kind of stir it up and make sure that all those air bubbles are released. The one thing you don't want to use is a knife or something sharp that could then score the inside of your jar, creating it could be a crack or a break during the processing time. You're always going to check for headspace and adjust as needed. So once you get those air bubbles out, you might be able to add a little bit more jam or jelly to your jar, add a little bit more salsa, spaghetti sauce, whatever you have, you might be able to add a little bit more. So you can always look and adjust your headspace. Then the fourth step is to wipe the rim with a damp paper towel. I tend to use vinegar and a cotton ball. It does the same trick. We're wiping around the rim of our jar, as you can see here in this picture. It's super important when we're doing jams and jellies because it's sticky everywhere. And so if you have a sticky mess on the outside of your jar on the rim, you will risk having a jar that does not seal. Same with canning meats. You can get a different fat residue on the outside. And while you might be able to see your sticky jam on your jar, you will not be able to see that fatty residue that then could cause a jar not to seal. So then the last step is you're going to place your lid on the jar and screw the band on, but we only do it finger tight. So we're not going to muscle that down because it can cause bending of the lid. It can cause a false seal. And so we're just going to finger tight it and it's going to be enough. When you drop that jar into your water bath canner, you're going to see air bubbles coming out. And people are like, what? There's air bubbles coming out. That's exactly what you want to see. You want to see that air escaping that jar. Once all that air is escaped the jar, then the lid is going to suction down onto your jar and create a seal. Processing times are super important. That's probably the most important takeaway that I want y'all to get is processing foods and then following your trusted recipe. So our processing times, the length of time that the jars are in the canner so foods are properly heated and the lids will seal. It's a crucial step in food preservation, and the processing time depends on the food your type of food, the thickness, and the way that you're packing your food into those jars. The processing time depends on the size of jar and the type of canner used. Processing times continued. All processing times in our tested recipes are research based and should never be adjusted. The only time it's adjusted is with the altitude level, and your recipe is going to tell you how you need to adjust that. Under processing can lead to food that is spoiled or unsafe. You can open those jars and see mold and mildew. Anything that is mold or mildew, you're going to throw away the entire contents of the jar. Those mold spores, once you see it on the top of your food, has infiltrated all of your food. And so you never want to scrape the top off of a moldy salsa and then think that you can eat it. It's absolutely not safe. And then over processing, what does over processing do? It will overcook your food. Now, if you're making baby food, that's perfect, but not if you want something that has some type of texture. Okay, so what happens during this process? I talked about it, but here it is in writing. The heat kills the bacteria that can cause illness or spoilage. The air is pushed out of the jar. As the jar cools afterwards, the vacuum seal is formed. The vacuum seal keeps the air and bacteria from getting back into the food. And so here you can see, to me, it kind of looks like they didn't follow the recipe on the right amount of headspace, but you can see here we have mold. And so this whole food content is going to be thrown away. You're not going to actually throw your jar away. Those can be washed and reused, but the food, the whole contents of the jar is going to be thrown away. Okay, so some more detailed points to our water bath. So again, here's our water bath canner. Again, you can use a big stock pot, crawfish cooker, something that you need, but this wire rack is super important. We cannot use these on a glass cooktop. The weight is so heavy that unless your cooktop specifically says like 60 pounds or more, we're not going to use these on a glass cooktop. At that point, if you have a glass cooktop and you want to do canning, you can buy an industrial burner that then you can put your pot on and use. You're going to make sure you always use the largest burner. You're going to fill the water that will cover the jars by 1 inch. You're going to heat your water. You're going to place your jars in the canner. You're going to make sure they're covered, again, by 1 inch at least, and that the jars are not touching each other. We want that heat source to go all around the jar, top and bottom. If we have it too tight in there, we can't get the heat source all the way through, and we risk that the jar of food may not come to an equal temperature. And again, in our water bath canning, we're aiming at 212 degrees. You're going to bring your water to a rolling boil and then process for the length of time. Most canners can double stack, which is a great bonus. You can do 14 jars. What we need to know and to note is that there should be a barrier between the first stack and the second stack. And so we definitely don't want the jars hitting each other. Okay, I am done with the processing. Now what? So you're going to turn your heat off. You're going to remove the lid. You're going to wait 5 minutes and you're going to open the lid away from your face. That steam can get up to 212 degrees and can easily burn you. You're going to want to remove 1 jar at a time and never tilt the jar. So the jar is going to have water on the top. Absolutely fine. Just lift it up. Move it straight over to the counter, not tipping. Some of your jars will not seal right away. That's absolutely fine. We'll talk about that. But if your jar has not sealed, you pull it up out of the canner, you're going to, if you tip it over to get some of that water off and it hasn't sealed, then guess what? You're going to have your salsa, your jam, any liquid in there is going to come out. So straight up out of the canner, over, straight on to the table. You're going to place your hot jars onto a towel rack or a cake rack in order for it to dry. You're going to leave 1 inch space in between your jars just so that it will cool faster. And you're going to let your jars sit undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours. And then hopefully in that amount of time, all your jars will seal. And you're going to know that they're sealed because you're going to be hearing these pings. And a ping to a canner is a happy sound. So always listen for those pings. And then you'll be able to see that the lid itself has been suctioned to the jar. Okay, so you're going to want to make sure that you check your jars to make sure that they have been sealed. I keep the slide in there as a what not to do. We never want to add force to our jars to make them seal. If they have not sealed on their own, there is a reason for that. It could be that there's debris around the rim. It could be that it has not been the right processing time. It could be that you have filled your jars too full. So we never want to force our jars to seal. So this is a no-no. But you can run your finger over the top so that you can see that it has sealed. Okay, so storing your canned items. This is a great slide, and I love how the example shows that you're going to label every single jar with what is in it. Once you start canning, it's kind of addicting, and you're going to want to do your salsa, your marinara sauce, your spaghetti sauce. Well, all of that kind of looks the same. And so we're going to label what is actually in the jars. Then you're going to date them. We're going to date them. We're going to eat the oldest food first. So we're going to be rotating our canned goods in, eating the oldest, putting the newest in the back. And we're going to label our jars by batch numbers. And the reason why we do this here, you can see this is B2, that stands for the second batch. So if you open up one of your jars and it has mold in it, then you're going to know that you need to check batch 2 of every single one to see if it has sealed and see which one. If you find one that has an off-putting odor or flavor, then you're going to want to dump all of that batch 2. Whereas if you had made 4 batches that day, you did not label which batch was what, then you run the risk of having to dump all 4 of those batches because you don't know which batch belongs to what, which ones didn't seal, which one has the bad smell or the bad flavor. So we're going to use our canned goods ideally within the first year, but we know that canned goods can last 3 to 5 years. We know they can even last longer if they're stored properly. And so where they're stored is just as important as how we're processing them. We need to store them in a clean, cool, dark, dry place. And so here in Southern Texas, that would not be our garage. I know lots of people up north store their their canned goods in a garage. That would not be a great place for us here. So a pantry is a good way, a closet. I see people storing them under their bed. That's fine. There's lots of different places to store them, but remember, it needs to be cool. It needs to be out of direct sunlight. Texas attic is a horrible place to store your canned goods. So what happens if your jar doesn't seal? It's gonna happen. If you notice that your jar did not seal within 24 hours, you have 3 options. So if you have one jar that did not seal, you refrigerate it and you just eat that within the next couple days, no problem. You can freeze that food if you would like, or you can reprocess. Now, if you're reprocessing, you're always going to use a new lid. You can reuse the ring, but the lid always gets ditched, and we're always going to use a new lid, and we're going to do the full processing time. Another tip that is important to note: if at any time your water stops boiling, you have an issue with your stovetop, you always have to restart your processing time. You can't say, oh, I'm going to process it for 10 minutes here, and then I'm going to leave and come back and process it, or, oh, the gas went out, then I'm going to have to process it again. You always do a full processing time, never split that up. And if you do not get a rolling boil the entire time, then you're going to have to reprocess that. So when to throw out our home canned foods? Well, if the jars were not processed correctly, I see that a lot. People will call me, email me, and tell me they have water bath green beans. Well, yes, you can absolutely can green beans, but the green beans need to be in a pressure canner. So if you have done something in a water bath canner that needed to be pressure canned, then you're going to have to dump all that out. If there is unexplained cloudy liquid, those need to be dumped. Now, you can get a cloudy liquid from a starchy food. So if you have some mixed vegetables and there's some small chunks of potatoes in there, you're likely to get some cloudiness in there. And that isn't explained. We know our starchy foods give us cloudy, so we're going to be okay. If you open your jars and there's a strange odor, we're going to dump that jar and we're going to check everyone else in that batch. If you open your jar and there's mold growth, we are dumping it all and checking all the other batches. If your jar did not seal and it has been longer than 24 hours, then you're going to dump them. Also, if you have a bulging lid, that means that fermentation has started. And if that's the case, you need to come to my fermenting class and we'll talk about fermenting. But no, just kidding aside, it is fermenting, but you're going to have to dump it because it was not done properly. Throwing out your spoiled and home canned goods. So for high acid food, we're not going to have to worry about botulism. So you can just dump that in the garbage disposal. Now for our low acid food and tomatoes, where you're running the risk of botulism, you need to place the unopened jars in a heavy garbage bag and place in the trash. You're never going to want to open them and get that all over your counter and then just wipe it with a damp rag. What you have done then is cross-contaminated and got everything on your counter with that bacteria. So if your jar is opened or leaking, you're going to boil that food for 30 minutes so that we can kill any bacteria in there. You're going to place your jars and lids in the trash. Clean and sanitize all cooking areas. You're going to throw out sponges or washcloths used in that cleanup because we want to make sure, again, that we're not making ourselves sick or anybody else sick. Okay, this was supposed to be a tomato class, right? And we haven't even talked about tomatoes. So now we're going to jump into the tomatoes. Here we go. I just love this picture of this guy collecting and picking all his tomatoes. We're going to make sure that we are picky about the food that we can. We can turn good food bad. I like to say, ask my husband and kids. I've turned plenty of good food bad. What we cannot do is turn bad food good. So if you're picking food that is moldy, discolored, there's no way we can make it better by canning it. So we're always going to pick the absolute best produce to can. So you're going to make sure that it is disease free, that it has been vine ripened or green. Yellow or orange tomatoes can actually be canned, not a problem. But you don't want to use tomatoes that are dead or from frost killed vines. So tomatoes, what to use? So tomatoes, if you want a thicker type salsa, you're going to use aroma tomato. The larger slicing varieties make a thinner canned product. So just know that there is going to be a difference in the outcome of what you are making depending on the type of tomato that you're using. So here's some tips for other ingredients. So if you have onions and white, yellow, or red, they can be substituted for one another if it is in the tested recipe. We're never going to increase the amount of onions in any recipe, because when we're adding that lower acid food to those tomatoes, we run that risk of not having the acid level where it needs to be to kill off those botulism spores. Herbs and spices, that's not an issue that we have with botulism. So you can definitely alter your herbs and spices or even leave them out. That's fine. We're never going to add flour, cornstarch, or any thickening agent before canning. And so I get that question a lot. People are like, what? No. So you're never going to can a gumbo. Absolutely not, because that roux has that flour. So then somebody else is going to ask me, but wait a second. I walk through the grocery store and I see canned roux. Yes, absolutely, you do. You'll see lots of canned foods that we cannot do in our home. And that's because they're using a commercial kitchen with equipment that they can actually reach those internal temperatures of 240 or greater, where we cannot in our home kitchen. So never add flour. If your salsa is thin, then you can add a thickening agent after you have opened your jar. So some general guidelines when we're canning tomatoes: you're going to rinse them under cool running water. You're going to slip the skins. And when I say slip the skins, what we're going to do is we're going to peel the tomatoes by placing them in a boiling water. Once they're in the boiling water, the skin is going to split. And so then you can dip it in the cold water. We're dipping them in the cold water because we are stopping the cooking process of those tomatoes. You're going to follow the recipe exactly. We're not going to alter any of the recipe ingredients. And we're going to pack into jars using those preferred method for the recipe. Some frequently asked questions about tomato canning. Can I can my own salsa? Absolutely, you can can your own salsa. Salsas are a mixture of a high acid and low acid food, so it's always best to follow a tested recipe. There are ways that if you're more advanced, you can test the pH of a recipe. If you needed to adjust that pH, you could add some lemon juice, but we really want to have you follow those tested recipes. Another question: can I can my own tomato basil soup? And the answer to that is no, we cannot can tomato basil soup. And the reason for that is because it has the heavy cream in it. Things that we cannot can are milk, any type of cheese we're not going to can, pasta, rice, processed meats. So when I say processed meats, we're not going to can a pound of bacon. That's not what we're going to can. We do process and can chicken. We can do roast, we can do deer meat, we can do shrimp, but never the processed meats. We're not going to can that. Whole wheat grains, dry beans, eggs, and flour. And so dry beans, people wonder about that too. That's because they expand. So when they are going to expand in that liquid, then we run the risk of our top popping. And so we're never going to can that. The last question I have: can you can your leftover spaghetti sauce? Absolutely, absolutely, you can can that. But if it has meat in it, then it jumps over to your pressure canning. So you're going to want to pressure can that. Find the recipe that is super similar to the one you have and follow those instructions. Pressure canning is fantastic. I've mentioned pressure canning, but I love that you can actually take your leftovers and can that. It'll save you on freezer space. So tomatoes, the good, the bad, the ugly. What are some problems that we see when we're canning tomatoes? One of them, oh no, my tomatoes are floating. This is a great picture of a floating tomato. That's because in these particular tomatoes, you can see they were probably full of air. And so 3/4 of it was a tomato, 1/4 of it was probably air. And so once we process that, all the air came out of the jar, it made the tomatoes float to the top. It does not affect the safety of the product. The raw food, again, has a lot of air, so we talked about that. Canning crushed tomatoes or using a hot pack often eliminates this problem. So floating is an issue that we see, but again, they're safe to eat. They'll be delicious. Oh no, my tomatoes are separated. This is a fantastic picture of a separated tomato. It does not affect the safety of your food, so you can go ahead and eat it. It's caused by an enzyme that's activated when your tomatoes are cut. And so what you can do is heating tomatoes immediately after they are cut, just to 180 degrees, will inactivate that enzyme. And so if you're having problems, this is kind of a tip or trick for your tomatoes that have separated. Okay, siphoning or liquid loss. These are two great pictures of the water loss that you can see. Siphoning is caused by a canner that's been heated or cooled too quickly or has a sudden loss of pressure. It can also happen when jars are packed too full, that there's not enough headspace. So then you have everything boiling out of your jar in the canner. You'll be able to see that when you open your canner and you have floating salsa all throughout your canner. Starchy foods, we do see this a lot with starchy foods. They will absorb some of your liquid. Also happens when we do chicken. You'll see the chicken absorbing some of that liquid. Well, it also happens when the air bubbles are not removed before processing. A pressure canner was not used correctly. You will see siphoning. So it may cause the food to darken, but the food is safe to eat. So that is our presentation on canning tomatoes. I hope that you learned a little something today. We have a Facebook group that we would love for y'all to join. It's called Brazoria County Canners. If you're searching for this Facebook group, you're going to want to search AgriLife Canning, and then this picture will pop up. Otherwise, you get Brazoria County Scanners, and that's not us. We are the canners of Brazoria County. So if you have any questions, you can ask us on our website, on the Facebook group. You can contact me via email. Always happy to answer questions. We offer lots of fun and exciting classes, and I always announce those classes first. About 95% of the classes we offer sell out. So you'll get tips and tricks to sign up for your classes early. So this picture right here, you can see was canned with, looks like old mayonnaise jars and lids. And this is absolutely not an improved method of canning with mayonnaise jars. So that was one tip that I didn't tell y'all early. We're always using our Ball and Kerr and mason jars. Okay, we have two upcoming classes. One is a Texas Wines and Small Bites. The other one is a seafood cooking school. All of our canning classes, they are offered monthly starting in January. We just wrapped up our last class. So we'll be starting our series in January. So are there any questions? Emily, do you see any questions in the chat? No questions in the chat. Okay, well, you can see here that this is my phone number to my office and my email. So if you have any questions, always feel free to reach out. Thank you for inviting me tonight, and I look forward to doing another upcoming program with y'all.
Thank y'all so much for joining us tonight. I also pinned a survey. We'd love to get event feedback for future garden lectures. So if y'all don't mind filling out our event feedback survey in the comments, we would greatly appreciate that. And thank y'all for joining us tonight.